Your taxonomy of the three types of internationalism I found extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and especially the third column, so classifying them based on the dichotomy between capitalism and democracy and how. So there is a sense in which of the three, the one with the most unstable relation between capitalism and democracy is precisely the liberal variant of internationalism. So for the radical type, clearly democracy takes precedence, and that's a sort of a stable model, if you wish. Whereas, and the same goes the other way around for the right-wing internationalism. There is a sense in which in the liberal variant, capitalism and democracy just don't sit very well together. And one of the reasons, so one way to interpret the difficulties that you've traced of the liberal variants of internationalism in the last few decades is precisely to do with, in a sense, the inability of classical liberalism to deal with some issues that sort of become very relevant at the international level, whereas they can be sort of almost swept under the carpet at the national level. So let me mention just a couple. So the first one is the acknowledgement of deep imbalance of power. Power imbalances are very relevant at the national level as well, but in a sense, they are much less evident. So there are a lot of fora where people can express their views, one person, one vote. This is especially true at the local level, etc. At the international level, in a sense, the power imbalances explode in their relevance. So some actors are infinitely more relevant. So in the UN Assembly, it is true that every nation counts as one, but in the end, it's not true that every nation counts as one. So Fiji and China don't count the same way. Same goes with the United States and other nations. So that's one, power imbalances. The second one is literally at the theoretical level. I found it always, so one of the most prominent exponents of modern liberalism is John Rawls. He's developed the concept of what modern liberalism is. And I found it striking that his view of liberalism literally stops at the national level. So he explicitly denies that his theory of justice, which is considered to be the liberal theory almost by definition, does not and should not apply to the international arena. So all his theoretical constructs, the original position, the veil of ignorance, etc., is only valid for citizens of the same nation. When it comes to justice at the global level, he says that's just bargaining between countries, which has always puzzled Rawlsians of all varieties. So he has to build this extremely baroque two-stage procedure in his theory, whereby his original theoretical construct applies at the national level, and then something else happens at the national level. And my take on this is that democracy at the international level is actually kind of almost scary for liberals. The idea of this Moloch of an international global state might actually infringe on economic liberties that are equally cherished. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. I mean, some really good points. I think there's one area where both those observations come together. I think you're absolutely right. Power at the international level, in the way it's institutionalized, we can take the UN system as an example. One country, one vote, as you say, is democracy undermined by the reality of power relations. The inverse of that, which is your Rawlsian example, is that democracy itself will do the undermining if you allow it to at the international level, and therefore you are best basically resorting to bargaining between positions. And Rawls' own take, as you get to on on the efforts of his followers to scale him up to the global level and try to find a way of thinking through a Rawlsian solution internationally, was always hesitant, I think. And I think one area where they come together is actually, what in another language we would call governance. Not good governance, not like countries and states pursuing certain policies that we deem to be, proper and appropriate and well behaved. But I mean governance in the terms of structures, organized systems, and principles by which countries are able to cooperate in ways that are fair and that do justice to each of their respective and different needs. One example of this is the UN principle of combined but differentiated responsibilities that you have in the climate discussion, for example, recognizing that not all countries are positioned the same way in relation to the problem. But that doesn't translate and hasn't translated thus far into actual governance arrangements for actual mechanisms which have actual power. So if you look at the way that, WHO operates, if you look at the way the Global Fund operates, if you look at the way that you mentioned Sceptre before operates, if you look at the way the majority of international multilateral frameworks operate, it isn't one in which actually we have the kind of constituency level approach to voting authority and power and voice that we have at the domestic political scale. And so the reason I say this is because I think we're locked in this discussion, or have been for a long time, that if you want to do better internationally, the only thing you can choose between is ideal perfect type cooperation, which never exists because power always will out, or you have some kind of global democracy. We had these debates in the 1990s ad infinitum, which is itself so abstract as to be meaningless and falls prey to the arguments of those that are against it, because it allows them to say, well, one person's going to be deciding the fate of millions of people. That's not how we want to be governed. What we don't have is the sort of representative constituency type based approaches to governing international organizations and the processes that they relate to. And that is part of the area, I think, that a civic internationalism would be very much focused on doing. It would be looking at the way in which we could organize governance so that, for example, countries pay their fair share, not simply one country, one vote, but a portion that relates to their GDP, to some element of their population size, that we can find ways of using the structures and the systems we already have at the national scale to settle these very problems. We have federalism, for example, in a number of countries, particularly larger ones. There are lessons from federalism that can be applied to the international scale that would allow cooperation to be much more productive. But what we haven't done is dare to sort of put that into a framework where we can say this is a way in which we could change the political relations, change that false choice, if you like, between the Rawlsian solution that can't ever happen and the reality of the alternative, which is power will out. And I think that's the task that we need to do. We need to build the institutional infrastructure to enable power to be managed at the international scale. That's the sort of target, if you like, of what a modern day internationalism ought to be oriented towards trying to do.